Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be diving into a relatively recent successful run I had on Covenant 25. Now, this was utilizing Glutton, and to be perfectly honest, I've struggled with this particular champion talent pretty much the whole time, even since the buff. I haven't had a whole lot of success, so I was very happy to get a win with this particular combination, so let's dive right into it. Now, as you can see, we have Devour Seraph, and our starting cards are a little strange. However, we do get Hell's Banners, which has proven to be very powerful. It's not something that I typically take because I haven't really grown accustomed to all the different combinations. However, here it seemed obvious simply because, well, you have morsels. It's going to be an easy way to generate things. Now, I chose Glutton simply because I specifically wanted to try it. As I said before, it hasn't been one that I've been very successful with, and I wanted to put some effort into it. Starting out with things like Grovel really made our lives significantly easier. On top of the fact that we had this particular artifact, we were able to generate a whole bunch of extra Ember without a whole lot of effort. So now we're, in addition to damage shielding our champion, we're loading him up with morsels. Now, I did make a mistake here to some extent in that I probably should have put him on a floor that had more capacity. But, you know, Covenant 25 does Covenant 25 things. It isn't quite the same as Hell Rush, which I've been playing a lot more of recently, in that you can set up on other floors, and that kind of influenced my decisions. I won't blame that as the reason why I made this particular error, but it was kind of a mistake. So from here, we're just debating the Crypt Builders, which are really awkward starting cards. It's very difficult to make successful use of them. Now, you can see that we don't immediately get the boss right away, but I mean, I wouldn't be doing this if we didn't successfully get through. So we're able to push enough damage through this guy in order to finally get there. There's not a whole lot to talk about on this first boss, but as you can see, there really wasn't too much to be concerned about. Gorge sometimes just does Gorge things, and the initial bosses here, we have, I want to say, cheat codes. The starting lifesteal on Glutton lets you do funny things. Now, I chose the Packed Morsels here and Titan's Tooth, specifically because A, Packed Morsels cost 0, and it helps thin the deck. When you're on Covenant 25, there are a lot of challenges, and part of that set of challenges is managing your deck size. The Titan's Tooth, however, was a concession to the fact that we don't really have a whole lot of sweep. There's not really a great way for us to get at the back row. Now, the Titan Sentry is an additional selection in that vein. We'll just make them bigger. Large sharks are large sharks, and there are funny things that large sharks can do. Spikes is always a challenging trial here. However, in this particular instance, since we're not Stygian main, aka Tethys with her meager health pool, we're able to really get through it. The Titan Sentry on the bottom floor allows us to clear out a lot of the trash, and setting up on a different floor, which I neglected to do on the first boss, allows us to feed all of those Glutton stacks much more easily. We're going to build up a ton of lifesteal and or a ton of damage shield and or just a ton of stats without having to put in a whole lot of effort. So things like the Grovel here are really going to, well, stack up. And that's the simple fact of the matter. Calling back to our initial artifact selection, this is why it's so advantageous. We're able to basically play our entire hand every turn or choose between all the things that we play every turn. Now here there wasn't a whole lot of benefit, but it was something beneficial in the grand scheme just because of the whole idea. Again, being able to play multiple morsels a turn to generate that additional Ember allows us to play Crypt Builders, allows us to play Mind Collapses, and set up these boss kills that we may not ordinarily be able to do. Now, in this particular scenario, we have a 52 attack champion up at the top. We were probably going to get there given how much we were softening up all of the trash throughout the entire floor, or the entire fight. Not a whole lot to be worried about here, and again, since we're not on Hell Rush, we don't have to set up those early boss rushes, although we probably could have and gone for an earlier one for a higher score. Now, I personally love Space Prism, and the obvious Titan's Tooth selection again was another concession to the sweep. But I love Space Prism because it allows us to be a little more flexible in what we're trying to select on any given floor. So, okay, we have to set up on the reduced capacity floor. That's fine. We'll eventually hit Space Prism in probably the first cycle and then be able to expand either the ability to play morsels or fit in other characters. Now, the dupe on the shark here is just, again, to set up things for multiple floors so that we can soften everything up. It's definitely going to help against bosses to stack up the frostbite. And we clearly are going to take the 150 gold here. We're still in a relatively healthy position, and I don't feel threatened at all going into Daedalus with this particular composition. So we do have damage shield Daedalus, which is a little annoying, but we can set up our Penumbra without having to sacrifice all that much. We can set it up on a floor that already has the capacity to sustain. We can crit builder because of the additional Ember, not to beat the dead horse. So now we're just talking about small trash things, and we're definitely on the game plan of just load up the Penumbra and go nuts. Now, I did make a mistake here because there was absolutely no reason to play the pack morsels on that floor where the incant guy is, but it's a minor misplay. It's something that can cost you in certain runs, but in this particular one, wasn't a big deal, especially because, oops, we'll just crit builder him and remove that guy from the game. So there's really not much going on here that you wouldn't expect. We're building up our Penumbra, which is kind of lacking at this stage. We're thinning out the deck to ensure that we're not drawing Train Stewards later on. We can cycle through from even just Shade Splitters. We'd love to get the Grovels so that we can get better morsels. There is a little bit of a concern because that back row tank is not, or back position tank rather, is not taking all that much damage, but we'll load them up with Frostbite and we'll get there. We're going to reduce a bunch of damage by eliminating all these characters, and Daedalus doesn't really stand a chance here. So we'll end up continuing to thin these things out. I am starting to enjoy the Glutton path more. I do think that it requires very specific things in comparison. I've had much more success with Architect. Architect is definitely my number one for Umbra, followed by probably Monstrous, because I think the game plans are much more straightforward, whereas Glutton requires some extra help. Now, one thing that you'll notice up here, unfortunately, we are going to eat some damage, and I'm trying to figure out what can we do here. It really doesn't matter because that guy is already below a break point. I probably shouldn't have played some of those cards, simply because he would have been below the break point and it wouldn't have mattered. Now, although earlier I was describing the fact that Daedalus didn't really stand much of a chance, you can see that we're not pushing a ton of damage here on him, but we're able to get him close enough, and the way I treat, well, close enough to smack him with the crit builder, that is. The way I treat Covenant 25 is really, it's just, can you successfully complete it? I'm not personally somebody going for the high score, although if I have the option to go for a higher score, I will. So it's very much the challenge of getting through Covenant 25 for me. And as you can see, we're able to accomplish that so far. The capacity crystal choice here is because, well, we just want to load up more morsels. We got to get all that gorge going as fast as we can. Now, we ended up going this route because we do have a bunch of cards that have way too high a cost. Additionally, Holdover that we're fortunate enough to get here is spectacular on Grovel. Now we really feel like we're going nuts. The Consume is something that I'll call attention to simply because it's getting these things out of the deck. You'd love to just purge them entirely, but you're likely not able to purge all of your starting cards or all of the things that you don't want in the build. So this is a simple concession to the fact that we got to find a way to get them out of there somehow, thin out the deck. And of course, we're going to go with Gorge 2 in order to try and stay consistent throughout this run. Now, the debate here was whether we want to try and do the trial. We might have been able to. However, I was playing it safe because this was, again, at least at the time, I did not feel very safe with this particular build. However, it turns out it worked out okay. So unfortunately, we don't have a great way to get that guy being the collector, but we do have the morsel maker in order to set this up. So we're going to do some awkward things such as mind collapse for a ton on just the collector, but it allows us to more effectively play this particular hand. Now from here, we're all in on the same game plan. It's just a matter of minimizing damage. So we want to make sure that we're loading everything up appropriately. We get our extra Ember, trying to sequence things properly so that we can ensure we're playing everything and wiping out as many of these guys as possible. Since now we have the holdover Grovel, to be perfectly honest, all bets are off. We're just going to go nuts with loading this guy up. We will, of course, get the boss. There's really no doubt about it there. But we're limited on getting cards out of our deck to ensure that we're drawing the other powerful cards outside of the Grovel. We do hit the Space Prism so that this way we can actually stuff more morsels. The Morsel Maker can make it a little awkward because it consumes those spaces. And we're going to eat a little bit of damage here because unfortunately we can't eliminate that guy up top completely. But as I said, we're not really in any danger. We do have a healthy health total, and getting that many morsel miners onto our champion feels spectacular. So it turns out we actually will be able to eliminate that back row guy with the Titan's Tooth there. And we're just running through at this point, buffing things where we can for funsies, which is kind of my battle cry when I'm streaming. Do a lot of things that are just for fun. And especially here when you're pretty much guaranteed to eliminate the bosses, eliminate these enemies, why not squeeze in some fun stuff while you're at it? Like, there's no need, for example, to play these morsels, but you might as well play them. Crypt Builder this guy just for good measure, and then annihilate him with Penumbra. The build definitely felt very straightforward at this stage. The fact that we started with the Grovel, I think, was a key component. However, the starting artifact was very important, and I know I've repeated that multiple times, but I think it requires additional attention simply because of how important it was. Now, I personally love concussive coals. There are definitely builds where, such as Spikes builds, where it may end up actually being a detriment because you want some of those guys to hit. Now, Large Stone is another upgrade that I love. It's often very difficult to ensure that it's valuable because it can definitely screw with the floors, but on a shark that's going to be holding down a floor all by itself, pretty good. I'm not counting on getting another one, so I'm just throwing the upgrade on the other shark. Given the gold total we have, there is a temptation here to re-roll, but I think there are definitely upgrades and other things that we'll need down the line that are more beneficial. This particular boss is one of several that are incredibly frustrating. However, between the big sharks and the fact that we're going to be loading up the Penumbra, I felt okay. It was fortunate that we drew this particular shark to put on the bottom, simply because we want the other one to stay healthy enough to also push damage against the boss just by attacking, as well as stacking up the Frostbite. However, we don't want to just put it out on its own. We want to keep it alive as long as we can, hence why we were eliminating some of those other enemies, even though the Frostbite would have claimed them. So we had to get some of these things out of the deck. It didn't allow us to then play the Titan's Tooth, but it didn't really matter since we stunned the one big DPS character with concussive coals, and we were going to get it with Frostbite anyway. So now we're very much into load up the Penumbra plan, and we're past the initial stages where we've ramped in the extent that we've gotten the stuff out that we need, and now it's just building them up. There is a little bit of concern here with that overcharged tank. That guy is enormous, and unfortunately we just don't have a spectacular way to deal with him. And this is a little sketchy here because we're risking death on our Penumbra, but obviously we could just throw characters in front and we'll wipe out most, if not all, of that row. The overcharge tank, as I was speaking about earlier, is unfortunately going to push a bunch of damage. There's nothing we can do about it at this stage. And that is the risk with some of these builds where it takes time to get rolling. You'll have one of these characters that just gets through, and they punch the crap out of the pyre. But we're mostly able to get there. We can get some morsels to load up the Penumbra, and we'll deal with this tank eventually or eat some damage. It's not the end of the world. In this particular case, we were able to deal with the tank pretty effectively. We're getting the other DPS at the top. We're not taking a ton of damage. Now, we do get some lucky stuns here, and we were able to build up that other zero attack shark on the bottom floor. So we're actually going to push a little bit of damage. We're going to eliminate the DPS characters relatively easily, but we're not going to push a ton of damage onto the boss, which is a little unfortunate. So we'll eat the morsels for mana so that this way we can ensure we're playing other things next turn. There's arguments to have them block, but since this is a multi-strike boss, it's not that big a deal, in my opinion. So we have a little bit of Frostbite, and we're not completely eliminating the boss yet. However, we're putting a significant amount on the boss so that the Frostbite between the shark and the other effects will end up ticking enough on the boss to eliminate it, if we actually got to the shark. In this case, just playing those other spells allows us to eliminate the multi-strike boss, which, again, is one of the more frustrating ones for me. In this particular case, it chews through a lot of damage shields and other issues, or causes other issues. Now, I love, or have learned to love, Cave-In, which is why I pretty much snap pick it here. I think it allows for a lot of interesting things whenever you have access to it. The most obvious being you can just quite simply drop any major characters from other floors the turn before the boss. Obviously, you want to get permafrost on it for those sort of scenarios, but it has other utility, as you'll see in some of the other videos I have here on the YouTube channel, or you can check it out on my Twitch page. I've made some mistakes before, but was able to utilize Cave-In order to save my butt. Specifically, I had other games where things were leaking through and I was just caving in the floors constantly because I made a positional or capacity error, and then was able to save the day by just stalling, essentially. Now, unfortunately, as much as I love Holdover, there's not much here to put it on. Upgrading these Mind Collapses means that they're always going to do something, even if I have to spend all of my Ember on other turns. So we're just getting cost reductions where we can. The double stack is, you know, it's a thing. There's definitely an argument to do it, but I wanted to ensure that we can get cost reductions later. Now, the Chaos Portal is something that I pretty much always utilize. There isn't really much that I was hoping for here. It's just more a matter of purging the train stewards. It's a free purge at worst, and then you get a little gold. So there's pretty much never a reason to avoid it. Now, Forever Consume doesn't do us a whole lot of good here. You could juggle things so that it's, with our initial artifact, you'll generate some extra Ember and then Forever Consume something, but not worth it in this particular run. I'd rather keep the deck thin. Just double checking the upgrades here to see if there's anything of value, but not so much. Now, one thing you should always do, and this will change in a future update, as was announced recently on the official Twitch stream, that they will state what the bosses do, what type of Seraph, what type of Fel, what type of Daedalus at the beginning. What I should have done, and you probably saw me skip it at the beginning, is I did not verify what type of Fel this is. So that was a slight play error, simply because we could have boxed ourselves into a corner as far as not having the mana, or excuse me, the Ember to play these Scourge cards. That being said, because of our initial artifact, we can kind of dance around this because we're again generating the morsels and generating this extra Ember, and we'll end up being mostly okay. Now, we did get the larger, or the large stone shark, excuse me, on the first floor. We're setting up on the middle floor with the Penumbra so that we can cave in down behind that shark as a tank. I think that the cave-in gets complicated because of having to continually feed the Penumbra. So if you cave in too early, you end up running into a bad position with being unable to then continue to feed it. So you have to be a little careful. But since we have the room to grow for this, we're just setting it up this way. Adding that extra morsel to the top just so the top shark has some attack. And at this point, we're well into the position of we're going to do our thing. We're going to load up morsels. We're going to stack Frostbite onto everything that we can, which, since this isn't Cleansed Seraph, quite obviously, we can get that Frostbite ticking onto Fel early just to whittle her down and allow us to get there a little more easily. A lot of this is just getting morsels out of the deck so we're not redrawing them, and getting the Train Stewards out of the deck for that matter. Now, we could cave in, but all of those morsels are going to go to the front row. So we could cave in from the top and try and put all the morsels there to feed our Penumbra. Obviously, we chose not to do that, although it was a consideration there for a few moments. My main issue with it was that we were then going to be unable to continue to feed the Penumbra, and we kind of would have been locked out. I wanted to get it a little bit larger. Unfortunately here, we are risking a few different things simply because those back row tanks, those back row fatties, yeah, they can get through and push a significant amount of damage, and we don't really have any way to address it outside of cave-in. We don't have a ton of direct damage. That one bled through for a little bit of damage. We will, or have the opportunity at least, to Crypt Builder here on the top row and get through somewhat, or a little bit extra damage onto this guy. It's not really a huge advantage if we were to go that route. Again, we're just going to take a little bit of damage if that guy bleeds through, but we are approaching this, as you can see, now there's a second tank. So that little bit of damage becomes a medium amount of damage, and then suddenly becomes, uh-oh, there's a whole lot of damage. So since we had the Ember to burn, we did look at double Crypt Building here, which allows us to put significantly more damage on the guy that's going to get through. We put a ton of damage on one of the mid-row fatties, and then we beat up the front of the mid-row fatties. Unfortunately, these penances are a little annoying. We are approaching the last turn, or we are on the penultimate turn, so we do need to consider the cave-ins here, because we got to get set up so that we can beat up Fel. Now, another point about cave-in that may not be obvious, like, well, why do we want it all on that row? It's similar to if you played any RTSs. If you stream in your units one by one, it's very easy for enemies to deal with them. However, if they're all packed tightly, then you can eliminate or fight opposing forces much more readily. Now, we caved in from the top to the bottom, or excuse me, from the top to the middle row, which you could have done it differently, but I wanted to ensure that we weren't potentially taking any other damage. We'll get a couple Titan's Tooths here because of the Ember generation. We're clearly not going to eliminate Fel on the bottom floor with this setup. We might have been able to otherwise, but we're going to get Fel here anyway. It's not quite as clean as maybe I would have liked, but as I was saying earlier, for me, running Covenant 25 is completing Covenant 25. That's the goal. It's not really the high score. I save that for my Hell Rush runs. So we definitely get the victory here, and we'll move on from Fel. Now, Shroud Mitosis I find fantastic in virtually any Penumbra, or excuse me, Umbra heavy build. Any of the Gorgers are very happy to have that in your deck. Now, the debate for the Crystal is where it gets interesting, because I was considering maybe if we take the Capacity Crystal, we could more readily set up 2 doubled morsel generations with the Morsel Master. However, the Shroud Mitosis eases that requirement somewhat. We definitely have a number of ways to ensure that we're feeding a ton of morsels now into the Penumbra. Now, we're going here for a bunch of spell upgrades. My thinking is primarily I want to get the Permafrost onto the cave-in. We want to get cost reductions. We could buff that other Mind Collapse, as you can see. We do get the Permafrost, so this allows us to ensure that we're going to have that cave-in the turn before the turn of the boss showing up. Now, the way this deck ends up turning out is we will either remove enough things from the deck via consumes, we've purged enough things out of the deck to keep it small enough that we are likely to get the cave-ins. There is an argument that you could end up whiffing on it, but with the Permafrost, you'll have the opportunity to play it early, draw it at some point thereafter, and be okay. So this is another debate with whether we take the challenge. But we do have multi-strikers here, which is a serious issue. And it's always a concern for me, okay, we're doing well on this run. Do we really want to risk it just for a little bit of extra gold? That at the end of the day, the upgrades are very important. Don't misunderstand. However, I'd rather not take the upgrade and then win the run than maybe get some extra upgrades and punt the run into the stratosphere. So we're setting up our game plan. We have a pretty good setup here. We clearly don't want to cave in yet. We need to get that guy up and running. And importantly, when you cave in and descend anything, they end up going to the back. So you would miss out on generating all those morsels. But there is a concern here now that we're really not doing much to that gilded wing. And by not doing much, we mean like almost literally nothing. So we're going to have to make some additional concessions to get there. The morsel going in front there to block to reduce damage. But we'll crypt builder the tank to the back, which eliminates a big part of the issue. Now we're at least putting some damage on this guy so that way it'll approach some breakpoints. And we have the opportunity, as we see here, to draw into some additional burn to remove him entirely from the game. Problem is, if we crypt builder, it's going to put him in the back, and then the tank is back up front, so our shark is not punching him. Primary focus, of course, is trying to get morsels set up. Secondly, we're trying to ensure that we get stuff out of the deck, so we're drawing what we want. The crypt builder plan ended up working out because we have enough, it didn't quite work out because we didn't have enough damage to eliminate that guy, so he bleeds through. So we'll just set this up. The Shroud Mitosis here, we're already pushing it on the unit limit, so we don't get a whole lot out of it, but extra morsels never really hurt. Well, I take that back. They never really hurt, depending on the circumstances. There's certainly times when it doesn't work out. So we can definitely get this guy at the top, and now it's just reducing damage. We're pretty much in a very good spot, even though these tanks seem to have a ton of damage. As you can see, we're at a 205 attack Penumbra. This guy is enormous, and he's only going to get bigger, and there's really no concern. So it's just, are we sequencing things properly? Are we getting the stacks of things that we want from the from the Shade Splitters to play into the Morsel Maker? We're just blowing that guy up because we can. Just playing cards for the sake of it. So we can cave in now safely, but we're going to drop some morsels here so that this way we can load this guy up. And by this guy, I mean the shark. It's going to end up going to him because he'll be at the front. Again, cave-in's going to put everything at the back. Just double-checking what morsels we have. We have, the Ember to burn. We're just leaving it open so we can Titan's Tooth and get these out of the deck on the off chance that something goes catastrophically wrong. So we're setting up in the middle here because I was actually concerned that we're not going to get the boss if we were to cave into the bottom. Since our Penumbra is just enormous, we'll give him some damage shields. This particular boss, damage shield is very strong against because he's only attacking once. We were able to Titan's Tooth the multi-striker away, so as you can see, we just annihilate this guy. Now, Feast is actually very interesting for this build. I don't know if it is required, but it definitely makes things so much easier because, well, the whole purpose of the build is stacking Gorge on Gorge on Gorge on Gorge. And, well, what's the easiest way to do that? We eat things multiple times a turn. So Feast is also very cheap, so it lets you, it allows you to do it no matter what's going on. And it's also another spell so that we can increase our spell count for Devour Seraph. That's one thing that I make this mistake a lot. I'll forget, and I say forget, air quotes, it's just me not paying attention that it's Devour Seraph and I lose spells. But Feast, even if I make mistakes, it can squeeze in a turn. So it gives you a safety blanket there. Now here I'm just debating, can we squeeze in some extra spell upgrades? Can we squeeze in extra unit upgrades? Or is there anything we want to dupe? Now, we rolled some interesting artifacts here. And we unfortunately don't have a whole lot of gold in order to purchase more than one of these. one of the drawbacks of not taking a lot of those challenges, which I believe allowed us to get this far. I think some of those challenges, the trials that we skipped, would have been pushing it, and we may not have even completed this run. Now, the Teeth of Gold are interesting as well. Really, all of these are very interesting. But the Mind Jacks allow us to do exactly what we were debating with the capacity crystals earlier. We can just set up the Penumbra on the middle floor now, especially because it's 2 extra capacity. It doesn't matter whether that's the reduced floor or not. We're still gaining, we're getting back to where we should be and then gaining 1 extra, the capacity crystal. So this will allow us to do all of the things we want to do anyway. We're duping the morsels, the packed morsels here, because again, it's 0. It's a consume to feed into the Seraph, so that way we can keep our other spells. I'm planning going into this primarily to feed Shade Splitters in otherwise, but it also gives us a ton more morsels, and then we can combo it with Feast and all the usual stuff to try and get things to happen. So as you can see, we just dump the packed morsels into it so that we can ignore, air quotes, the consume portion of the Seraph right away. Titan's Tooth on the bottom floor, both to eliminate DPS, put some damage on Seraph, and maybe most importantly, get rid or allow us to eliminate that tiny Seraph, tiny winged that keeps putting cards into our hand. That thing is super annoying and actually actively disrupts our entire process. So again, here, Shade Splitter gets fed in so that way we're not feeding Grovel in, which I've unfortunately done on other occasions, as I said, not paying attention. Now we're very much on the morsel plan. We need to block here so that we don't risk any damage. While we should be in very good shape, I am still, again, this is one of my few successful Glutton runs at Covenant 25, so I was very concerned that there's a chance that we don't get there. So we're now playing that delicate dance of, since we didn't get set up quicker than this, we got to make sure we get enough cards out of the deck to thin it out. We need to make sure we're not feeding anything inappropriately into Seraph. And we also need to get the morsel generation, the morsel train running. We're pretty much going to load up the Penumbra to an absurd level. Now this guy, if we have the option to deal with him in a number of different ways. And I'm debating here which ones are the most appropriate. We want to play the Frozen Lance being a consume to get it out of the deck, although there's an argument, again, to keep it in so you can feed it in later. But I felt we had enough spells to make this viable. Now here I wanted to make sure that rather than preserve a little bit of health on the shark, we wanted to ensure that we were actually getting the shark damage to get Frostbite on the appropriate characters, just so we can push a little bit more damage. We have our Frozen Cave-In, so for the most part, everything's going according to plan here. And as you can see, we're not leaking characters up to the top floor. We're able to play the Vengeful Shards, where we have the option to Crypt Builder. Everything's going pretty much swimmingly now that we've gotten over the hump. There's always those early few pivotal turns where it's going to decide how a particular fight is going to go. Because once you fall behind against certain combinations, certain bosses, certain whatevers, it's very difficult to ever get back. Because whether it's Harvest, and I know that's not part of this run, or it's Gorge, which is part of this run, or other effects, sometimes you just can't quite get there once you fall behind, because now you have too many characters, you just can't push enough damage, and it becomes a big challenge. Here, we're not really risking that, although this back row, or back column, Gilded Wing is potentially going to be an issue. So we'll generate our extra Ember, feed more Shade Splitters in, get rid of these Vengeful Shards. I guess we could have just eaten the damage. We're at 111. That extra 2 damage is not going to make a significant difference, just so that we can Mind Collapse this guy for more, if we really chose to. It's not the end of the world. Most of this is going to carry us through. The problem is that guy now at the top, as you can see, is not taking a significant amount of damage. We'll still be able to push through, but it's becoming risky now that there is a second one that's building up. We're going to get extra Frostbite on him to try and soften him up. It's not quite... I always feel better when we can eliminate or soften this guy up significantly more, but by virtue of the Penumbra not having trample, not having multi-strike, this is very tough. So here's the debate. Do we cave in now? Obviously, I chose not to, but there is an argument to do it because the Penumbra is still pretty large. We would have the Shark, although at the back. The Penumbra's at 465 attack with damage shields and extra health. It's just really how many more turns do we have until Seraph is going to show up to actually start fighting us. And sometimes you really just wish Seraph would finally show up. So the damage calculation here is, again, of course, can we mind collapse things while doing everything else we want? We do have the Crypt Builder to allow us to deal a significant amount of damage to these other characters. So this is going to put this guy not quite into range, but close enough that we can feel better about ourselves, that we're not eating a million damage, which these guys can easily do. It's funny, the back end DPS characters typically seem the scariest. They have big attack values, sometimes they have multi-strike, they're protected by all these other characters, but the big issue often is these humongous hit point DPS characters, or excuse me, tank characters. Now in this case, we caved in a little early. Those guys are not taking anywhere near the amount of damage that we were hoping, so that could have been a humongous blunder. That Shark is not doing a whole lot in the back when it comes to actually dealing out his Frostbite, which is the primary thing. So you can definitely almost feel my regret on this. So it's just a little bit of math to try and figure out what's our most appropriate play. Obviously, the row that we're fighting in the center is virtually irrelevant. Now, this, I believe, was actually an error. These characters on the middle row are irrelevant. Either we're going to kill Seraph or we're not. And the damage from these guys, okay, if they got there instead of Seraph the next turn, it doesn't really matter. So I should have Crypt Buildered the top floor just to reduce some incoming damage, but at the time, I think I was just playing it a little safe, too safe, in fact. As you can see, those top row characters, the ones that previously were there, actually dealt a significant amount of damage. In the end, doesn't matter, never had to worry about it, never didn't have it, right? Right? Maybe it wasn't quite that clear at the time, but we are able to take down Seraph in one of our first Covenant 25 successful Glutton runs, and it felt good, to be perfectly honest. It's a talent that I said at the very beginning had kind of eluded me, the strategy for it, and I can already see, even as I was going through this, other strategies forming in my head to ensure that Glutton did well. At the end of the day, if you have a 665 damage Penumbra, it's kind of hard to not win, and that actually is something that I want to call attention to as we're going to go through the end motions, and I'll talk a little bit about more when we get to the deck list. If we didn't get this win, it kind of would have been a little embarrassing because of the power level of the things that were afforded us. But as you can see, we ended up getting a couple extra cards, a couple extra borders, that is, for cards, and we were able to put another notch in our logbook with this particular Covenant 25 victory. Umbra Stygian was not one that I had had prior to this. So let's take a look at the deck list for a moment. As I said, this worked out pretty well right from the beginning. We really got pretty much all the tools that were necessary, and it would have been, in retrospect, kind of embarrassing if we didn't win with this particular combination. We were able to get some spectacular upgrades on the Titan Sentries. We were able to duplicate the Titan Sentries also and early on. We got Morsel Master, which I think is very important for this particular build, more so over Morsel Maker. I've actually had a lot of challenges with Morsel Maker because if you don't pick up Feast, then it ends up getting really weird as far as trying to align certain things. Shroud Mitosis obviously came in late. It normally is very strong, but didn't seem to make a whole lot of impact here because we were able to get the Morsel Master and dupe things. In a slightly different configuration, I could see it being very important. The Mind Collapses, surprisingly, were very good, simply because we were able to get those upgrades on them, so they became useful. Other than that, the crypt builders also put in a lot of work. As you saw over a course of a number of different fights, they were important in ensuring that we secured kills on the trash waves or pushed a boss to actually being in range. The pack morsels were clearly very important. A lot of the deck kind of is self-explanatory, to be perfectly honest. The Cave-In is, of course, my favorite MVP, and Holdover Grovel would definitely be up there for pretty close to MVP. Now, looking at the artifacts, again, we started out with a spectacular one and then picked up other strong ones, even though we didn't hit a huge quantity. So this deck really came together very well. I hope that everybody enjoyed this particular playthrough. If you enjoyed this, please check out my Twitch channel or subscribe to this YouTube channel if you'd like to see more content. Let me know any of your thoughts down in the comments. And as always, everyone, thank you for listening, thank you for watching, and Black Lives Matter.